Great. Hi everyone. My name is Paul Ligety, and I'm the president of the Historical Society of West Windsor. Thank you everyone for coming. Today we're going to be talking about a timely subject, given the fact that the nation's 250th birthday is coming up next year, which is New Jersey's role in the American Revolution, including a little bit of West Windsor Township's involvement. Our speaker tonight is Tom Burnet. Now, Tom is recently joined the board of the Historical Society of West Windsor. He's a retired corporate executive, an author, and a lifelong lover of American history. He's going to be covering the origins of the war, the major events from 1776 to 1783, and New Jersey's critical role in the American Revolution. Now, before I go to the next slide, I do want to emphasize that there's going to be a question and answer session at the end, which will be your opportunity to ask any questions. In the meantime, if you can please mute yourselves if you haven't already done so, so that everyone can enjoy the presentation. Tom, next slide. So, a quick note about the Historical Society. We are an all-volunteer nonprofit. We were founded in 1983, so we've been around for about 42 years, and we're run by your friends and neighbors who volunteer their free time. The Historical Society manages the West Windsor History Museum off of Southfield Road. We're about a minute down the road from Grover Middle School. We're also right across the road from the Cranberry Golf Club. We have several historic farm buildings to explore, and I encourage you all to visit us during our regular open houses. One of them is coming up in August. We have a big concert/open house called the History Music Fest. We also do a number of other things. We offer student scholarships. We lead history tours, lectures like this one, preservation initiatives, and much more. However, we simply can't do all this without community support. So please either consider donating or volunteering. To donate, you can go to westwindsorhistory.com/contact. It should be a T at the end of that. That's on me. Many of the Historic Society's activities do, cost money, and we rely almost entirely on private donations. So if you care about local history, please either, again, consider donating or volunteering. Next slide. Now, a few years ago, the Historical Society published a full-length book on West Windsor history. This explores everything about West Windsor history from the Ice Age to the present day. You can buy it at the link shown here or at many of the Historical Society's upcoming events. Now, the book is probably one of the best ways to understand the broad arc of local history, of West Windsor Township's history specifically. But of course, lectures like this one go into far more detail. 100% of the proceeds go to our nonprofit, so you'd also be helping us while also learning about the broad overarching history of our township. Next slide. Now, again, I mentioned that next year the United States turns 250 years old. And the Historical Society has been preparing for this by organizing what's called Revolution West Windsor. This is a township-wide committee that is composed of us, most of the town's major community groups, from the Arts Council to both fire companies, the Bicycle and Pedestrian Alliance, West Windsor Community Farmers Market, the Lions Club, Police Department is joining, and there's a few others as well. And it also involves the township itself as well. And we're collaboratively planning about 50 events from about 2025, around this time in 2025, until the end of 2026. I mean, you can think of parades, lectures, tours, dances, art exhibits, and a whole lot more. So look forward to that. We have a website about it where you can see all the events that are coming up. You can also learn about a little bit more about West Windsor's specific role in the Revolution, including things that will be covered in this lecture, things that won't be. And you can learn how to join and other initiatives that we have ongoing. So again, I'd encourage you to go to the link at the bottom of the screen when this lecture is over and learn about all the great things that we're doing. Next slide. Finally, I do want to consider, and this is the last slide before I hand it off to Tom, I do want to, again, recommend that you consider volunteering with us. Volunteering is open to all neighbors, including adults and students in 8th grade and above. And there are a variety of different opportunities, from museum tour guides to lecturers to people who work on various preservation initiatives. For example, we're working to install cast metal signs at different historic sites around town, We're also working to save a local cemetery that dates back to the mid 1700s. So it's a variety of different things. Again, the volunteer sign up link is at the bottom here, westwindsorhistory.com/contact. I also do want to note one thing, which is that one of our volunteers put in the chat that we have an ongoing summer fundraiser where, again, we rely entirely on donations. So that's your opportunity to support. That fundraiser ends in exactly 1 month on July 12th. So you can support right there. Next slide, and I'm going to hand it off to Tom. So, Tom, if you want, please take it away.
Thank you. Thanks, Paul. Good evening, everyone, and thanks for joining. As Paul mentioned, my subject tonight will be the American Revolution and New Jersey's role in it. New Jersey has the well-earned reputation as being the crossroads of the Revolution, and specifically West Windsor and Mercer County played a pivotal role at a very crucial time, which I will talk about at some length. A couple of housekeeping items. One that Paul already mentioned was just please mute your iPhones and phones and whatever, which you seem to have done. And the second is that I'm going to shut off my video of myself so you don't have to be distracted and you can actually focus completely on the story at hand. So with that, we move on. The map you're looking at is pretty strange. It's the map of colonial New Jersey, and it was done in 1664. And if you're using this as a GPS guide, you pretty much stay lost all day. But it is where we start our story. And the fact that the map is actually upside down is really the least of its problems. But in any case, this extraordinary piece of land was originally a Dutch colony until around the time this map was done in 1664, when control went from Netherlands to Great Britain. This was during the reign of Charles II. The land grant was given to two English aristocrats, not a bad deal, Lord Berkeley and Sir George Carteret. They both were royal supporters of King Charles I when he still had his head, and became royalist supporters after the English Civil War was complete and the Restoration in 1660. They named the land New Jersey after the Channel Island off the southern coast of England. That's also where Carteret had been governor. The land was sparsely populated, but it grew steadily to about 100,000 people by the time of the Revolution, which is about 5% of the total population of the 13 colonies at the time. Much smaller than Pennsylvania or New York or Virginia, but a player nonetheless. Now, if you want to really understand the underlying cause of the American Revolution, you've got to understand the French and Indian War. That was fought between 1754 and 1763. It was regarded by historians, and it has been regarded by historians as really the first truly global war. And it was yet another in a series of conflicts between England and France, which started back in 1066 and went through 1815 and Napoleon's defeat at Waterloo. In the 100 years prior to the French and Indian War, the French and the English had already fought 4 separate wars. So this was yet another rivalry. It was a world war in the truest sense. It started here in the US. It spread to Europe. There was fighting in West Africa. There was fighting in India, even in South America, and of course some of the Caribbean. The combatants were on one side Britain and Prussia, and the second time, and on the other side was France, Austria, Spain, Russia, and the Holy Roman Empire, which at that point in time was not much of an empire. It certainly wasn't Roman anymore, and it's questionable whether it was even holy. The first battles, as I said, were in North America in the Ohio Valley, where the settlers had a significant need and almost an unquenchable need of continuing to move west. And they moved over the Appalachians, and the battles between then the English and the French began. One of the first battles was when a young George Washington entered the world stage fighting on behalf with the British in what was now Pittsburgh, and fighting in the Battle of Fort Necessity, um, which he lost badly in, to be honest. He was lauded for his valor, but not for his strategic sense. Ultimately, though, after all said and done, the English won a resounding victory. The French lost Canada. As you can see on the map, they lost Canada and all the territory east of the Mississippi. And I'm sure you're thinking at this point that's all very interesting, but what does this have to do with the American Revolution? Well, I'm glad you asked. The significant impact of the British victory was a significant increase in the British debt. The war was, and of course always remains, a very expensive business. Their debt doubled from 75 to almost 150 million pounds. While this amount seems trivia today, back then they liked to balance their budget. And so this was a significant concern for the English and King George and the Parliament. The debt load not only was unprecedented, but to make it worse, as they viewed the settlers in their increasing desire to move west, they knew they were going to have to set up some sort of boundary, some sort of standing army to keep the English, the American settlers away from further incursions with the Native Americans and the French. Up until this point in time, Parliament had charged zero for the American settlers to live their lives. But with this huge deficit staring them in the face, they had to raise taxes by some means. And so it was not a very difficult step that they took to start taxing the colonies. Of course, that proved to be a fateful decision. Um, First thing they did, I think a lot of you know this already, so I can maybe move through it fairly quickly. The Stamp Act, I'm sorry, the Sugar Act, which was the first tax by Parliament on the importation not only of molasses, but also coffee, wines, silks, and linens. And it was also intended to put an end to some of the smuggling that was coming out of the Caribbean. That was step one. Step two was the passage of the Stamp Act. Now, this was a direct tax on all printed materials, be it legal and official papers, attorneys' licensings, wedding licenses, newspapers, pamphlets, playing cards, even dice. Um, Obviously, this provoked a very strong response. Uh, and a year later, after considerable angst on the part of the colonists, it was repealed. The third thing they did, which was very controversial, was called the Quartering Act. This required colonists to provide lodging, food, and drink for British soldiers. It also mandated that the colonists pay for those costs. Very strong negative reaction. And if you look at the Bill of Rights that we have today, look at the Third Amendment, which talks about illegality of quartering soldiers in private homes. This stems from this Quartering Act of 1765. Not to be outdone, they then passed what became known as the Townshend Acts. That was the Chancellor of the Exchequer at the time. This was a tax or a tariff on glass, lead, paint, paper, and most notably and most notoriously, tea. This was also an attempt to further crack down on smuggling. It was obviously just as the other acts were pushed back very strongly by the colonists, and within a couple years, all of those uh, taxes were removed, with the exception, notably, of tea. Um, the one thing I didn't put on here, which is probably maybe the most important from a colonist standpoint, was the Proclamation Act of 1763, which essentially the king and the parliament banned settlement west of a line which roughly traversed the Appalachian Mountains. This was another source of irritation for the colonists, and frankly, it was largely ignored. Um, Other things the colonists did in response: boycotts, street demonstrations. This is where the no taxation without representation saying emanated. Forming the Sons and Daughters of Liberty, making tea locally instead of importing it from East India or China, making their own cloth and using spinning bees. They established a committee of correspondence. This was basically a network and an organization where they shared news and ideas with each other. It was really the first real communication between the 13 colonies. This is where Sam Adams and Paul Revere and Thomas Jefferson, Patrick Henry, and the like came on the scene. It was pretty much the 18th century equivalent of email or social media. In 1770, I didn't put this on here, but you had the infamous Boston Massacre, which, depending on which side you were on, was either a slight skirmish or a brutal massacre. 5 people did die in the shooting, which was in March of 1770. Probably the most famous was the Boston Tea Party. Sons of Liberty organized this, dressed very thinly disguised as Mohawks, dumping 342 chests of Chinese. So they actually thought it was East Indian tea because the British were involved with that, but it was actually Chinese tea, and $1 million worth of value. Fair to say that the King George was not amused and um, passed another act called the Intolerable Acts, which essentially the British occupied Boston, closed the harbor, established military governor, and put on even more severe trade restrictions. As a result of that, the 12 colonies got together and convened the First Continental Congress in Philadelphia, developed the Declaration of Rights, not the Declaration of Independence, but the Declaration of Rights and Grievances. Clearly something had to give. The 10 years now of continuing increasing tensions, the colonies were growing stronger by the year, not only by economic growth, but by population growth. Not quite self-sufficient yet, but they were feeling stronger each year. At the same time, there was no question that England was the preeminent power in Europe and potentially the Western world. We're sitting on a powder keg, and something had to give. Before I continue, just a note on nomenclature and a comment about division in between the two countries. This was not a simple issue of us versus them, of America versus England. There was significant division within America, divided very, very much between strong loyalists and strong rebels. It's very hard. It's almost impossible to get a good percentage on that. But most of what I've read says about 20% of the population were for king and crown, and the other wouldn't say the other 80 were rebels, but a good piece were either agnostic or on the rebel side. New Jersey was no exception to this. And as I go through it, I'm going to talk about rebels and continentals on one side and redcoats and British on the other. It didn't seem right to call the rebels American because America, as I said, was really significantly divided at the time. It's not wrong to refer to the Revolutionary War as actually the first civil war for the United States. So something, as I said, something had to give, and not surprisingly, given all the events that had happened up in Boston, happened in Boston at the battles of Lexington and Concord. The British were ordered to go find munition dumps that were in west of the city. Rebel intelligence kicked into gear. This is where Paul Revere and his famous midnight ride, one if by land, two if by sea. And a fast horse was the best way to tell the story. There's no truth to the rumor that the internet was down that night. The first shots were fired at Lexington. The battle then moved on to Concord. There were 8 rebels killed in Lexington, and then Concord. The rebels availed themselves better, more ammunition, and the Minutemen showed up, and the British turned back and made the 20 or 5 or so mile trek back to Boston, harried the whole way. The war was, at this point, was on. 2 months later, we're still in Boston. Battle of Bunker Hill. In this case, this is really the first set piece battle, where you had 2,500 rebels, 3,000 British charged up the hill, were repulsed and did it again. Eventually, the rebels ran out of ammunition. It's probably never a great idea to attack uphill wearing bright red coats, but I guess that's for a later generation to figure that out. But this is where the saying "don't shoot until the whites of their eye, you see the whites of their eyes" emanated, which is probably an urban legend, but it has endured. The rebels lost 450 in terms of casualties, the British over 1,000. And the Battle of Bunker Hill was the bloodiest in terms of British losses over the course of the whole war. And after the battle, the Second Continental Congress convened to coordinate a war effort, and that's where George Washington was appointed commander-in-chief. Now, fast forward to the middle of 1776. In June, Richard Henry Lee, who was president of the convention, asked for a resolution for independence, which is ironic because 85 years later, his great-grandson, Robert E. Lee, was playing a slightly different role as preeminent general for the Confederacy in the Civil War. But I don't want to get off on a digression. I might be here all night if I talked about the Civil War. A committee was put together, a committee of 5 it was called, to draft the document. We know that Thomas Jefferson was one. The others were Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, Robert Livingston from New Jersey, and Roger Sherman from Connecticut. They went through 2 sets of edits. One of the sources I had said they went through 86 edits, to be specific. I don't know how they tracked that back then, but assuming they had 86 edits, I can't imagine that Jefferson was in a great mood by the time their work was done. There were 5 signers from New Jersey. But before I talk about that, just make sure that everybody remembers the most memorable phrase, which I think is good to remember these days. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, those being life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. For you trivia buffs, there were 1,320 words in the Declaration, 32 sentences, 27 grievances levied against the king, and We know that John Hancock took up way too much space in the signing of that. But there were 5 signers from New Jersey. Richard Stockton, who has a strong West Windsor connection, and lived in Morven, which is the Princeton estate. He was a lawyer. He also had 300 acres he owned in the West Windsor area. John Witherspoon, who was at the time the Princeton University president. Francis Hopkinson was a lawyer who later designed Continental Paper Money. John Hart and Abraham Clark. And it was signed, I think, not on the 2nd. I thought it was actually signed on the 4th, but there's some, I mean, on the 2nd, not the 4th, but there's some debate about that. So you'd think that at that point in time, with all the burst of enthusiasm around the independence, that we would have a short war and then the English would turn tail and run. That's not what happened. What happened after Bunker Hill was that the British abandoned Boston. They moved to capture to New York in August of '76. The British at that point in time were under the command of General Howe, and his brother commanded the Navy. Washington left Boston with his troops to stop him from taking New York. The result was an unmitigated disaster. Each defeat worse than the last. It lost at the Battle of Brooklyn, Battle of Kips Bay, Battle of Harlem Heights, the Battle of White Plains, the Battle of Fort Washington. Washington did not cover himself in glory in any of those engagements. New York then was about 25,000 people, not as large as Philadelphia at the time, but became a loyalist stronghold, and it would remain in British hands for the rest of the war. So New Jersey now takes center stage in the conflict. The rebellion was at a low ebb. New York was in the hands of the English. Washington, who had started the Battle of New York with 20,000 men, was down to 3,000 at that point. He then retreats from basically New York City through New Jersey. All the time, supplies dwindling, desertions happening, enlistments expiring. It's getting cold. It's November. British raids were frequent, including as they got down here further, closer to us in the West Windsor area. Washington adopts essentially what's called a Fabian strategy, not Fabian, the guy that was on American Bandstand in the 60s, but it was named after Quintin Fabius Maximus, who's a Roman general in the Second Punic War in the battles against Hannibal. Don't worry, it's not going to be on the final exam in any case. The Fabian strategy, which has been used in other times in other wars, is basically to avoid battle, avoid anything decisive at least. And it's not unlike guerrilla warfare, but this is one of the first times the British had encountered this, and it was very frustrating for them. Washington retreated across New Jersey beginning in November 21st from Bergen County and arriving across the Delaware in the early part of December. A little over 110 miles he went. They went down basically what is today Route 1, following that was called the King's Highway back then. And on December 1st, he lost more enlistments, and even more were going to expire as of January 1st, 1777. Once he gets over the Delaware River into Newtown, Congress, seeing the writing on the wall, promptly evacuates Philadelphia, and they flee to Baltimore. So, the old saying, it's always darkest before the dawn. That's certainly apropos here. The first change of luck, so to speak, was around that time when General Howe called off what would have been a pretty easy assault on the remaining troops and capturing Philadelphia. Called off the attack to go back into winter quarters back in New York. And he took Cornwallis with him, General Cornwallis. He left a small force of German mercenaries called Hessians in Trenton and a few other central Jersey towns. So this is when we come to what we call the 10 crucial days. I think everybody knows what this is. This is the famous Washington crossing the Delaware, which was painted by the German artist Emanuel Lutz in 1851. It hangs in the New York Metropolitan. It's, I think, 12 foot by 21 feet. It's just massive. I don't want to be a nitpicker about it, but there's several problems with this. Just thought I'd point them out. The flag is wrong, not appropriate for that year. The size and the shape of the boat is wrong. The time of day is wrong. He crossed at the dead of night. That looks like dawn to me. And I'm not sure they'd let anybody stand up, but he was the commander. Anyway, I move on. On a serious note, he was gambling everything on crossing the river to come back to Trenton. Good news, a few days before, some reinforcements came, but still it looked very dark and meager. He had planned to attack Trenton at three different points, both above north of Trenton, which is where he was in, and then two south of Trenton. The other two never made it. Other two attacks never made it. And he picked obviously a terrible day of ice and sleet and rain to attack. On the good news side, though, the 9-mile march to Trenton went without detection, and total surprise was achieved. It was a short fight. There was basically no rebel deaths, only 4 people injured. Actually, ironically, one of the 4 that were injured was James Monroe, the future president. Then he was only 18. 21 Hessians were killed and 1,000 were captured. It was actually Washington's first victory. I want to say ever. It was his first victory. There was always a myth that the Hessians were drunk, and that's why we won, but there's never been any documentation to support this. But there was documentation to support the fact that what rum there was, the rebels took back when they recrossed the Delaware the next day. So that's first few days of the 10 crucial days. On December 30th, West Windsor takes center stage. A scouting party led by Colonel Reed captures 12 British dragoons right where you see the star on the map on December 30th. They gain some key intelligence about the future plans for Cornwallis, who had come back from New York when they heard about the first battle at Trenton. So that intelligence was very important for what transpires here for the next few days. Unfortunately, that site no longer exists. It was razed, demolished years ago. So we'd love to be able to show that off. That would be a terrific asset for the historical society, but alas, it's not to be. So after this first battle, as I said, we got some intelligence that Cornwallis was coming back to Trenton to counterattack. He did march into the outskirts of Trenton. He left a small garrison back at Princeton, a few miles away, but we were aware of that, that he was coming, and Cornwallis did attack several charges. We now had up to 6,000 in reinforcements, so a significant increase in reinforcements, and make a strong stand at what is called Assam Peak Creek in the center of Trenton, and turn back several British charges. It's now the night of January 2nd. The day was the second battle. The night of January 2nd. Washington is now assuming that they're going to resume their attack the next day. In the past, he might have retreated, but he's feeling bold from the last couple of victories. So he decides to take another bold move, and he decides to flank the British and attack Princeton, because he knows they've got a small force there. So now we come to the night march of January 2nd, 3rd. Washington's goal, as I said, is to flank Cornwallis. It's a 14-mile mark from Trenton, goes through Hamilton, essentially traverses what is today the Quaker Bridge Road, and through right where the Nassau Park Pavilion is right now. And he gets to the Princeton, to Princeton, or at least the outskirts of Princeton, in the morning of January 3rd. He now has 4,500. He had left about 1,500 soldiers back with their campfires burning to mislead the British that he was still there in force. And he stumbles in the morning. They stumble upon the British right where the purple battlefield marker is there, and it's General Mercer. His brigade stumbles into the British 17th, and the battle is fought out in the orchard of William Clark's farm. It's a furious battle. General Mercer is mortally wounded. His men are routed. Here's a picture, actual picture. His men are routed. Washington rallies his troops, sending General Cadwalader into the breach. And again, his rally, or his attack is broken down. So the rebels have been beaten twice, and then Washington comes to the rescue again, leading the troops for the third time. The British are routed. This all happened very quickly, within a couple hours' time. They lose a quarter of the men. Rebels lose about 500 prisoners, and British are barricaded, retreat, and are barricaded back to inside Princeton, actually inside Nassau Hall, where legend has it young Alexander Hamilton shot cannon-blasts through Nassau Hall, and caused the British to leave the building and surrender. It's a fun fact that Princeton gets shout out as the site of the battle, but if truth be known, the site of the battle actually at that time was in West Windsor. So we do claim at least have it for where this very important battle took place. So the three battles there in that space of time, all victories. As they say, we didn't necessarily win clutching a victory out of the jaws of defeat, but it was something very close to it. So the importance of the 10 days can not be overstated, although I did come across one historian who I need to read the quote because it's pretty close to being overstated. It may be doubted whether so small a number of men ever in so short a space of time had a greater or more lasting effect on the history of the world. So there you go. But hyperbole aside, the 10 days were unquestionably one of the turning points of the war, and it happened right here. It was a massive change in momentum. The British were stunned. George Washington now suddenly becomes the man of the hour. there's a surge in reenlistments. The British withdraw completely from New Jersey and retreat back to New York City. The rebellion survives, at least more dark days were ahead for sure, but there was renewed hope. This is the battlefield as it exists today, very calm. And there's no question that at this point in time, we need, I guess I need to make a transition into the next phase of the war. Washington goes and sets up his winter headquarters in Morristown, and the British devise a new strategy. They want to sever New England from the rest of the colonies by moving south from Canada under General John Burgoyne, with General Howe moving up from New York, where they plan to crush the rebels outside of Albany at Fort Ticonderoga in upstate New York. Sounded like a good plan, but Howe decides he doesn't want to do that, changes his plan without telling Burgoyne, and moves instead to capture Philadelphia, the largest city in the colonies, as I said, where he planned to crush Washington's band. He sailed to Philadelphia with 18,000 men and defeats Washington on 3 separate occasions outside of Philadelphia, in Brandywine Creek, at Paoli, and finally at Germantown. Not unlike the losses in New York. So Howe then proceeds on to an undefended Philadelphia. So it's another very low ebb with the colonies or with the rebels. And so we've seen the picture. I think everybody knows about the winter they had to spend in Valley Forge. 2,000 men died of starvation and exposure. But there was a bright spot in New York. This is where the rebels, led by Horatio Gates and the soon-to-be infamous Benedict Arnold, defeat Burgoyne, capturing him and his army at the Battle of Saratoga in October of 1777. And it was that victory which most historians call the turning point in the war, which I think it was, on par with the 10 crucial days. And it led to the French coming to our aid in 1778. They had enough confidence that we were going to at least survive for a few more years. And the French were motivated, of course, by an opportunity to avenge the defeat in 7 Years' War. Under the direction of King Louis XVI, they'd been building up their naval presence to counteract the British. Benjamin Franklin played a huge role. He lived in Paris at the time and was instrumental in not only helping organize smuggling of guns from France to the colonies in the early years of the war, but also in just basically marketing the rebel cause. That entrance of the French really did change British motivations at this point. And in 1778, a few months in June of 1778, the British actually suddenly abandoned Philadelphia. Not because of anything Washington did, but just because of the threat of the French and what they could do. There was a worry that the French were going to invade England. There was worries that they would take their ships down to the Caribbean and capture some of the British islands down there. So their focus was really off the colonies for a time period. And they ordered, the king ordered Henry Clinton, who is now in charge of the British forces, to go leave the colonies and go capture French possessions in the Caribbean. He ignored the order and left Philadelphia to head back to New York. Um, Now, this is the fourth time the British had over into crossed over our state, and it must be said that this time, even more than the other times, they were uh, intent on foraging, burning, looting, and worse, which had the consequence of really building up colonial resistance. So we come to the next battle, and the third most significant battle in New Jersey, and it's the Battle of Monmouth Courthouse. This happened as Clinton was marching east from Philadelphia, heading for New York, and Washington followed him at a distance, but followed him nonetheless. And they met at Monmouth Courthouse, which is about 20 miles east of West Windsor, on June 28th. Uh, there were Washington's three flanks of his army. One crossed through Trenton, one crossed through Windsor, the central, and the one in the north went through Hopewell, and they all met at West Windsor, as I say, on the 28th. These were large armies, 14,000 for Washington, 18,000 for Clinton. It was a brutal battle. The temperatures were near 100. And again, like several other battles, uh, it started out with vague orders from Washington, confusing cavalry charges. British were about to take the field, and Washington again kind of broke out from the rear and led a charge, and essentially cleared the field, uh, declaring a victory for the rebels, which was probably not deserved. The English, essentially, it was a tactical draw, but both sides declared victory, and the English were able to march unmolested the rest of the way to New York. There was other battles in New Jersey, none of this sort of magnitude. Bound Brook had some fighting. Battle of Short Hills. There was another one close to us in Millstone. Paulus Hook, which is modern day Jersey City. Red Bank, Springfield. Fort Mercer, which is near the Delaware River. All in total, there was nearly 100 battles in New Jersey of one size or the other, much more than any other state. After this, after that battle in mid 1778, England grew even more weary of the conflict and the constant guerrilla style of fighting, and also their worry about what the French were going to do. Um, we were also not in great shape. We were hungry almost all the time. Disease was rampant. Um, and one way or the other, there's both sides were just pretty well beat from at least the mid-Atlantic and the side of the war. The fighting moved uh, south to Georgia, South Carolina, a little bit of North Carolina, where important battles were fought. And the British actually did much better in the South, um, but they couldn't fully secure any of the states. And the fighting effectively ended in October 1781 at the Battle of Yorktown, where the French were very important, and crucially, they bottled up with their navy, bottled up Cornwallis and his army. Uh, Time doesn't really permit me to go through a lot of events in the war. I mean, some of the things I would have loved to have at least touched upon: Thomas Paine and his common sense, the failed invasion of Canada, Nathan Hale, I regret that I have but one life to live for my country, John Paul Jones, I've not yet begun to fight, the betrayal of Benedict Arnold at West Point, the Culper spy ring, the burning of the multiple Connecticut seacoast town by the British, the miserable prison conditions, the stories of really unbelievable brutality that they didn't put into our elementary and high school history books. Um, Multiple naval battles the French and British had off the coast of France and also in the Caribbean. And then in battles as far away places as Maine and Illinois and Missouri and Florida. The Treaty of Paris in 1783 put a final end to the war. The U.S. is recognized as an independent nation. Mississippi River becomes the western boundary, and that was negotiated by the ubiquitous Ben Franklin as well as John Jay and John Adams. Very quickly, just a summary of what follows. We're an independent country, but we're not in great shape. The end of the war left us with a lot of problems, essentially worthless currency, unpaid debts, veterans that hadn't been paid in years, Native Americans attacking a lot of outposts near the Appalachians, passage of the Articles of Confederation, which had multiple flaws in it, no national court system, couldn't couldn't no executive branch, which is ironic given today. What they did establish a Congress, but no executive branch. There's essentially 12 states acting like, or should not even states at that point, 12 colonies acting like 12 or 13 sovereign nations. During that time, there was also an ever rotating seat of government, and I use government in quotes because there really wasn't much of one. And Philadelphia was the site of some meetings in the early years of the post-war. Annapolis, the State House of Annapolis, they met a few times. New York City Hall, Fraunces Tavern, as well as the Nassau Hall at Princeton. Evidently, the cannonballs from Hamilton had been removed at that point in time, and they met on the second floor library. And also in Trenton, at the French Arms Tavern, they had a meetings there in November, December of 1784. That was owned and operated by another important West Windsor native, Jacob Bergen. Unfortunately, the building was demolished in 1837. It is now, I believe, a Wells Fargo branch bank. So country was floundering at that point in time. And beginning in 1787, people realized we had to do something different. And there was a subject of a whole new lecture, time willing, but the drafting of the Constitution and the ratification of the states, which are all obviously very, very critical to our future. New Jersey's contribution during this was the cleverly named New Jersey Plan, which gave equal participation by states in a unicameral legislature. In other words, they wanted to have a Senate, but not a House of Representatives. They established a central government which did have authority to levy taxes, unlike the Articles of Confederation. They did add an executive branch and a judiciary branch. It was not the final plan, because the final plan, of course, added a Senate and a House, but New Jersey was important in moving the debate forward. And New Jersey became the third state to ratify the Constitution in 1787, after Delaware and Pennsylvania. Just in conclusion, Jersey played a critical role in the war. The 10 crucial days, the strategic, geographic location between New York and Philadelphia. They played a significant role in disrupting British resupply efforts. Massachusetts can rightly claim its place because of the genesis of the revolution, and there was a lot of fighting in New York and in South Carolina, but in my admittedly biased way of thinking, this was the place where the revolution was saved when it looked like it was sure defeat. And my hyperbole for the day is, if for not for those 10 days, history on this continent and probably in the world would have turned out much differently. So before closing, I wanted a couple other parting thoughts. One is on the unsung heroes, showing two images here. Women played a significant role, and they never do get enough ink in any of the wars, but certainly not in the Revolutionary War. Boycotting efforts, the Daughters of Liberty, very important. Abigail Adams, Elizabeth Bergen was a major player in the culprit spy ring, and Molly Pitcher, who was pictured there at the Battle of Monmouth Courthouse, and many, many others. Word about also black soldiers, which I was not aware of before I got into the study. Black soldiers fought on both sides. One estimate is about 5,000 fought for the rebels. The British took their share of black soldiers as well. They offered freedom, which of course petrified the slaveholders, especially in the Deep South. It should be noted that rebels did not make a similar offer of freedom to their black soldiers. Nonetheless, the black soldiers did play a critical role, particularly in the Battle of Yorktown. Interestingly, the units were integrated, something that didn't happen again in the United States for another 200 years. Trying to get a sense of the total fighting force, I was looking at some numbers. It was very hard to get a good handle on it, but it looks like as many as 250,000 men at one point in time served in the Continental Army, and the population of the U.S. at that point in time was 2.5 million. But if you take out women and the old and loyalists, it's a very high percentage of available men that actually fought in the war. There were about 6,800 deaths on the rebel side from combat itself, 25,000 in total. A lot of that's from disease and terrible prison conditions. To put that in perspective, that 25,000 again is 1% of the American population at that time. The Civil War, the equivalent number was 2% died. So it was a brutal time with a lot of death. Length of the war, 7 years. Although, as I said, weren't battles sprinkled evenly throughout those years. There was most of the battles were in the 76, 77, 78 time period. And it was the longest combat in the U.S. before the Vietnam War. And New Jersey, hopefully, made some points that make sense, that it being the crossroads of the revolution. And in my opinion, there are two miracles. The first miracle is that we were able to beat a major superpower, and the second miracle is that we're able to survive as a nation after the rough first 20 years. Thank you for your time.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Tom. So now we're going to open it up to questions and answers from anyone who has anything.
Tom, this is Jeff French. Can you hear me?
I sure can. How are you, Jeff?
Great. I appreciate this. I wonder how much you know about communications and delay. There are stories about battles such as the Battle of New Orleans happening after the war was declared over. And I think about communication across the pond when I hear that General Howe, I think, ignored orders. You wonder if part of the reason they were ignored was beyond ego, but as much to do with how conditions on the ground had changed by the time he received orders. And I just wonder, I know about Paul Revere, but I wonder how much you know about the complexity of communication and the delay associated with this. As you indicated sort of earlier, cell service was notoriously poor in those days.
It was. It's gotten better. It's gotten a little better. Yeah, I'm amazed. I mean, the crossing on the English Channel, or the crossing of the Atlantic was easily 2 months, depending on the time of year.
Hmm.
And yeah, I can't help but believe that every battle was essentially under the command of the local guy at the local time, making his best decisions. I mean, and this is a classic. King George and the Third is talk about being in an ivory tower. You're 3 months late on everything. So yeah, I agree that not just on the ones I cited, but you're right. The famous one, the Battle of New Orleans, being what was it, a month after the end of the War of 1812. So yeah.
It looks like we might have gotten a question in the chat. Yeah, Nancy Sheehan is asking, similarly, how did George Washington command 14,000 troops, and how did he send information and directions to the troops?
Sorry, how did he command 14,000 troops? Yeah,
Well,
I think, well,
yeah, it was mainly about the communication. How did he send info and directions to his 14,000 troops?
yeah, if you let's take the specific one where I quoted 14,000. He left Philadelphia with three, and he sent his army in three different directions, and he put them under the command of three different generals. So they were never more than probably 15, 20 miles apart from each other as they went towards Monmouth. So it was probably, relative to the question Jeff was asking, probably a lot easier for messengers to go back and forth between the three different flanks of the army. Nonetheless, I have no doubt that in the heat of the battle, when decisions had to be made instantaneously, those individual generals were also on their own. So much less, you're right, sending Washington talking to General Gates in Ticonderoga. They were that was a month probably itself to try to make that trip.
Tom, I have a question. Soma here.
Yeah.
What was the cost of the war for Washington, and how did he raise funds?
What was the cost?
Yeah, financial cost.
Yeah, I don't know that I've ever seen a number on the cost, but when you talk about how did you raise the funds, at the risk of being slightly cynical, they printed a lot of worthless currency.
Oh.
I mean, they had no financial basis. I mean, they probably did a fair amount of kind of hands out, asking the local, aristocrats for their money to help aid in paying the troops. But they started to print continental currency in 1777. And by the time the war was over, that currency was being used, at least anecdotally, as wallpaper. So the short answer really to me is there was reserves in people's houses, but short of that kind of hard currency, it was very tough. So there was a lot of debt being incurred. That states incurred a lot of debt, and very little was repaid. It wasn't really until the mid 1790s when Alexander Hamilton devised a plan post Constitution, the Constitution, to have the new federal government pay all the state debts. So people were living on a on an IOU system as much as anything else.
Okay. If anyone has any other questions, obviously. Oh, sorry, someone was talking?
No, I'm fine. Yeah. Thank you.
Well, on that note, Tom, I don't know if you have any parting thoughts. I just want to say thank you for everyone for coming and submitting questions. But Tom, if you have anything else.
I don't. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah, I'm happy to take them. But hopefully there was something you could walk away with. And I think it's a topic that's apropos, to be honest, not only because of 250, but because it's important to recognize what we fought for back then.
Yeah.
Thanks,
This was a
Tom.
good presentation, Tom.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Okay. Bye-bye.